What if nearly 900 American sailors could vanish from the face of the earth and nobody noticed for almost 5 days? What if a heavy cruiser carrying more than 1,000 men could be torpedoed, sunk, and erased from existence while the United States Navy went about its business, completely unaware that anything had happened? What if the difference between rescue within hours and rescue after 4 days and 5 nights of unimaginable horror came down to one simple question that nobody bothered to ask: where is that ship? This is the story of USS Indianapolis CA-35, the heavy cruiser that completed the most secret mission of World War II and then disappeared into the vastness of the Philippine Sea, without anyone checking to see if she had arrived at her destination. This is the story of how a routing order was issued and filed and forgotten, how a ship's expected arrival was noted and then ignored, how the systems designed to track naval vessels and ensure their safety had broken down so completely that a major warship could simply cease to exist without triggering any alarm. 900 sailors survived the torpedo attack that sank Indianapolis on the night of July 30, 1945. They made it into the water with their life jackets, expecting rescue to come within hours. They knew distress signals had been sent. They knew the Navy would notice when their ship failed to arrive at late. They knew that someone, somewhere, was tracking their progress and would raise the alarm when Indianapolis went silent. They were wrong about everything. Nobody was tracking anything. Nobody noticed when the ship failed to arrive. Nobody asked any questions. Nobody checked the route. For 4 days and 5 nights, those 900 men floated in shark-infested waters, dying by the hundreds from attacks and exposure and dehydration, while the Navy they served had completely forgotten they existed. The route was never checked. The arrival was never confirmed. The ship was never missed. And by the time anyone realized something was wrong, nearly 600 men were already dead. USS Indianapolis was a Portland-class heavy cruiser, one of the workhorses of the American surface fleet during World War II. She had been commissioned in 1932 and had served with distinction throughout the Pacific War, participating in numerous major operations from the Aleutians to Okinawa. Her crew of nearly 200 men had survived years of combat, earning battle stars and campaign ribbons that testified to their service and sacrifice. By the summer of 1945, Indianapolis had established herself as a reliable and capable vessel. She had served as the flagship of Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet, carrying the admiral through some of the most important naval operations of the war. Her captain, Charles Butler McVay III, was a respected career officer from a distinguished naval family, the son of an admiral who had himself graduated from Annapolis and dedicated his life to naval service. In July 1945, Indianapolis was at Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California, completing repairs from battle damage suffered during the Okinawa campaign. A Japanese kamikaze had struck the ship in March, causing significant damage and casualties. The repairs were proceeding normally when Captain McVay received orders that would change everything. Indianapolis was to proceed immediately to Tinian Island in the Pacific, carrying cargo of extreme importance and extreme secrecy. McVay was not told what the cargo was. He was told only that it must be delivered with maximum speed, that the ship should make the fastest possible passage across the Pacific, and that if Indianapolis was in danger of sinking, the cargo must be saved at all costs, even if the ship itself was lost. The cargo that was loaded aboard Indianapolis on July 16, 1945 consisted of 2 items. The first was a lead-lined container holding the uranium-235 core of an atomic bomb. The second was a metal canister containing the bomb's triggering mechanism. Together, these components would be assembled into the weapon called Little Boy, which would be dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, killing approximately 80,000 people instantly and helping to end the war. McVay knew none of this. He knew only that his mission was vital and that failure was not an option. Indianapolis departed San Francisco on July 16, the same day that the first atomic bomb was successfully tested at Trinity Site in New Mexico. The ship raced across the Pacific at high speed, arriving at Pearl Harbor for a brief refueling stop before continuing to Tinian. The secret cargo was delivered on July 26, offloaded with the same security that had surrounded its loading. The men of Indianapolis had completed one of the most important missions of World War II without ever knowing what they had carried. Now they received orders for their next assignment. Indianapolis was to proceed to Guam for routing instructions, and then to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, where she would join a task force preparing for the anticipated invasion of Japan. It seemed like a routine assignment, a straightforward transit through waters that the Navy considered reasonably safe. The ship would sail alone, without escort, following a route that had been approved by the routing authorities at Guam. At Guam, Captain McVay met with the port director and routing officer to receive his orders for the voyage to Leyte. The meeting was routine, the kind of administrative procedure that happened dozens of times every day as ships moved across the Pacific. McVay was given his route, his expected arrival date, and instructions for reporting to the task force commander at Leyte. McVay had one significant concern. The road he would be taking passed through waters where Japanese submarines had been reported operating. He requested that a destroyer escort be assigned to accompany Indianapolis on the voyage. Even a single escort would provide some protection against submarine attack, and would ensure that if something happened, there would be another ship to report the incident and rescue survivors. His request was denied. No escort was available, McVeigh was told. The submarine threat in the area had diminished significantly in recent weeks. Intelligence indicated that enemy submarine activity along the planned route was minimal. Indianapolis would sail alone. What McVeigh was not told would prove fatal to his crew. Just days earlier, the destroyer escort USS Underhill had been torpedoed and sunk along a route similar to the one Indianapolis would be taking. The submarine that sank Underhill was believed to still be operating in the area. This information was available to the routing officer at GOM, but it was classified at a level that prevented it from being shared with McVeigh. The captain was being sent into danger without knowing how serious that danger actually was. The routing order that would doom 900 men was issued based on incomplete information shared incompletely with the one person who most needed to know. Indianapolis departed Guam on the morning of July 28, 1945, sailing westward toward Lake Gulf at approximately 17 knots. The ship was traveling alone through waters that the Navy had assured McVeigh were reasonably safe. He established a zigzag pattern during daylight hours to make the ship harder to target by submarines, but discontinued the pattern after dark when cloud cover reduced visibility to near zero. The crew settled into the routine of a peacetime transit. Young sailors wrote letters home. Veterans discussed their plans for after the war. Officers reviewed charts and planned for the ship's arrival at Leyte. The war was clearly approaching its end, and many of the men looked forward to going home to families they had not seen in years. None of them knew that they were being hunted. None of them knew that a Japanese submarine was positioning itself along their route. And none of them knew that if disaster struck, no one would come looking for them because no one would know they were missing. The system that was supposed to track Indianapolis and ensure her safe arrival at Leyte had multiple components, each designed to provide redundancy in case another failed. The routing order specified the ship's planned course and expected arrival date. The port director at Leyte was notified that Indianapolis was en route and should arrive on July 31. The Philippine Sea Frontier Command was informed of the ship's movement. In theory, this system should have worked. If Indianapolis failed to arrive at Leyte on schedule, the port director should have noticed and raised an inquiry. If the port director failed to notice, the Philippine Sea Frontier should have tracked the ship's progress and noted when she went silent. At multiple points in the chain, someone should have asked the simple question, where is that ship? But the system had broken down through a combination of complacency, unclear procedures, and the fatal assumption that someone else was handling the problem. The port director at Leyte, Lieutenant Stuart Gibson, had a standing policy of not reporting the non-arrival of combatant ships. This policy had been established because warships frequently changed their orders in transit, were diverted to other missions, or arrived at different ports than originally planned. The constant changes made tracking difficult, and Gibson had decided that it was simpler to assume that non-arrivals were intentional rather than cause confusion by reporting ships that had simply been diverted elsewhere. It was a policy born of wartime expediency, an attempt to reduce paperwork and administrative burden. It was also a policy that would cost nearly 600 lives. When Indianapolis failed to arrive at Leyte on July 31, Gibson did not raise an alarm. He assumed the ship had been diverted to another destination or had been delayed for routine reasons. He made no inquiry. He sent no messages. He asked no questions. The heavy cruiser with her crew of nearly 200 men simply disappeared from the Navy's awareness without anyone noticing. The Philippine Sea Frontier Command was equally negligent. They had received notification of Indianapolis's movement, but had no system in place to track her progress or confirm her arrival. They assumed that Leyte was tracking the ship. They assumed that if something went wrong, Leyte would report it. They assumed that someone else was doing the job. Nobody was doing the job. The route was never checked. The arrival was never confirmed. The ship was never missed. Japanese submarine I-58, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Mochichiro Hashimoto, was patrolling the Philippine Sea on the night of July 29, 1945. Hashimoto was one of the few experienced submarine commanders still alive and operational after years of devastating losses to American anti-submarine warfare. He had been at sea since the beginning of the war and understood both the opportunities and dangers of submarine combat. Just before midnight, Hashimoto spotted a dark shape on the moonlit horizon. He could not immediately identify the vessel, but he could tell it was large, probably a warship, and it was traveling alone without escort. It was the kind of target that submarine commanders dreamed of, a major enemy ship presenting itself without the complications of escort vessels or aircraft. Hashimoto brought I-58 to battle stations and began maneuvering for an attack. He had both conventional torpedoes and the new Caton manned suicide torpedoes available, but he decided to use conventional weapons. The target was well positioned for a standard torpedo attack, and there was no need to sacrifice Caton pilots when a conventional approach would work. At 10:05 on July 30, 1945, I-58 fired 6 Type 95 torpedoes at USS Indianapolis. The torpedoes streaked through the water at over 45 knots, invisible in the darkness, closing on a target whose crew had no idea they were under attack. 2 torpedoes found their mark. The first torpedo struck Indianapolis on her starboard bow, detonating near the forward ammunition magazines and aviation fuel storage tanks. The explosion was catastrophic. It tore off a significant portion of the ship's bow, killing dozens of men instantly, and starting fires that spread rapidly through the forward compartments. Aviation fuel ignited, creating an inferno that lit up the night. Before the stunned crew could react, before damage control parties could even begin to organize, the second torpedo struck amidships on the starboard side. This explosion was even more devastating than the first. It destroyed the forward engine room and fire room, cutting all electrical power and plunging the ship into complete darkness. It ruptured fuel tanks throughout the midship section, spreading burning oil through the interior of the ship and across the surface of the water. Captain McVeigh was thrown from his bunk by the explosions. He grabbed whatever clothes he could find and made his way toward the bridge, climbing through darkened passageways that were already filling with smoke and flooding with water. The ship was listing heavily to starboard, and McVeigh could feel her sinking beneath his feet as he climbed. What he found on the bridge was chaos. The forward part of the ship was a mass of flames, ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions that sent debris flying through the air. The deck was tilting at an increasingly steep angle as flooding spread through the hull. Men were screaming somewhere in the darkness, trapped in compartments that were filling with water. McVeigh's first priority was to send a distress signal. If he could get word out about what had happened, rescue ships could be dispatched immediately, but the explosions had destroyed the main radio room and killed most of the communications personnel. The primary transmitters were gone. The antenna systems were damaged. It seemed that Indianapolis would sink without anyone knowing. But some radiomen had survived. They made their way to emergency equipment in other parts of the ship and began attempting to transmit SOS messages. Working with backup gear that was never designed for this kind of situation, they tapped out the ship's position and her desperate situation. The messages went out into the night, carried by radio waves across hundreds of miles of ocean. Those messages were received at 3 different shore stations, and at all 3 stations they were ignored. At the first station, the watch officer decided the distress call was probably a Japanese trick. The enemy was known to broadcast false messages to lure American ships into ambushes. Without confirmation that Indianapolis was actually in trouble, the officer ignored the message. He did not log it. He did not report it to his superiors. He simply dismissed it as probable deception. At the second station, the commanding officer was allegedly drunk and had left orders not to be disturbed. His subordinates, afraid of waking him and facing his anger, noted the message informally but took no action. They did not contact other commands. They did not initiate a search. They waited for their commanding officer to sober up, and by then the message had been forgotten. At the third station, the distress signal was received but lost in the routine flow of communications traffic. It was filed among dozens of other messages treated as one more piece of paperwork. Nobody recognized its urgency. Nobody flagged it for action. Nobody did anything at all. The SOS was sent. The SOS was received, and the SOS was ignored. The route was never checked. The ship was never missed. Approximately 12 minutes after the first torpedo struck, USS Indianapolis rolled over and plunged beneath the waves. She took with her about 300 men who had been killed by the explosions, trapped in flooding compartments, or unable to escape the sinking vessel. Nearly 900 men made it into the water alive. They were scattered across several miles of ocean in the darkness, most of them wearing only Kapok life jackets. Many were wounded from the explosions. All were covered in the thick fuel oil that had spilled from the ship's ruptured tanks, oil that burned their eyes, clogged their throats, and made the water around them a black, viscous nightmare. As dawn broke on July 30, the survivors could see the full scope of their situation. They were floating in the open ocean, far from any land, far from any shipping lane. The horizon was empty in every direction. There was no sign of rescue, no ships, no aircraft, no indication that anyone knew they were there. The men organized themselves as best they could. Officers took charge of larger groups, establishing watches and maintaining discipline. Swimmers tied themselves together with belts and clothing to prevent groups from drifting apart. Everyone scanned the horizon constantly, waiting for the rescue ships and aircraft that they believed would arrive at any moment. They had faith in the system. They knew that distress signals had been sent. They knew that Indianapolis had been expected at late. Surely the Navy would notice when she failed to arrive. Surely search planes would appear within hours. Surely someone was checking the route, confirming arrivals, tracking the movement of ships across the Pacific. They did not know that no one was checking anything. They did not know that the port director at late had a policy of not reporting non-arrivals. They did not know that their SOS messages had been received and ignored. They did not know that they had been completely forgotten by the Navy they served. The first day passed without rescue. The survivors told themselves that help would come tomorrow, that the Navy needed time to organize a search, that aircraft would be overhead by morning, They maintained hope even as the sun beat down on them without mercy, even as thirst began to torment them, even as the first sharks began to circle. The sharks arrived within hours of the sinking, drawn by the blood of wounded survivors and the disturbance of hundreds of men struggling in the water. Oceanic white-hip sharks were the primary predators, bold and aggressive creatures perfectly adapted for hunting in the open ocean. Unlike coastal sharks that typically fled from human presence, oceanic white-tips were fearless, willing to approach and attack prey much larger than themselves. The first attacks focused on the dead and dying, on men who had succumbed to their wounds and were floating motionless in the water. The survivors watched in horror as sharks circled their groups, then suddenly rushed in to grab a body and drag it beneath the surface. The attacks were fast and brutal, over in seconds, leaving only a spreading cloud of blood where a man had been. But as the hours passed and the sharks grew bolder, they began attacking the living. Men who drifted away from their groups became targets. The wounded, whose blood continued to attract the predators, were particularly vulnerable. Sometimes a shark would rush in from below without warning, grabbing a man by the legs and pulling him screaming beneath the surface. There was nothing the survivors could do to defend themselves. They had no weapons. They could not swim away because there was nowhere to go. They tried to stay in tight groups, hoping that larger numbers would discourage attacks. They tried to remain still, avoiding the splashing that seemed to attract the sharks. But nothing worked for long. The predators kept coming, day and night, patient and relentless. The second day passed without rescue. Hope began to fade among the survivors. Some men started to break down psychologically, the combination of thirst, exhaustion, and terror overwhelming their ability to cope. The officers worked desperately to maintain morale, to keep men focused on survival, to prevent the despair that would kill as surely as the sharks. Thirst was becoming unbearable. The human body cannot survive long without fresh water, and the tropical heat accelerated dehydration dramatically. Men's lips cracked in blood, their tongues swelled, their throats became so dry that they could barely speak. The desire for water became an obsession that crowded out all other thoughts. Some men began drinking seawater despite warnings from their officers that it would kill them. The temptation was overwhelming. Water surrounded them in every direction, billions of gallons of it, and they were dying of thirst. Surely a little bit would not hurt. Surely their bodies could process some of the salt. But seawater is poison to the human body. Its salt content is far higher than the kidneys can process. Drinking it causes the body to use its remaining freshwater reserves to eliminate the excess salt, actually accelerating dehydration rather than relieving it. Worse, the salt causes neurological damage that leads to hallucinations, confusion, and violent behavior. Within a day of drinking seawater, men began losing their minds. They saw things that were not there. Islands appeared on the horizon that did not exist. Ships came to rescue them that were only hallucinations. Some men became convinced that Indianapolis had not really sunk, that she was floating just beneath them, and they could swim down to get fresh water from her drinking fountains. Men drowned trying to reach a ship that lay thousands of feet below them on the ocean floor. Others became paranoid and violent. They became convinced that Japanese soldiers were among them, that enemies had infiltrated the survivor groups, that their own shipmates were trying to kill them. Fights broke out in the water as deranged men attacked the people beside them. Murder occurred in some groups, though the exact number would never be known. The saltwater madness spread through the survivor groups like a contagion. Men who had been stable began to crack. Officers who had maintained discipline found themselves fighting to control sailors who had lost all connection with reality. The groups that had formed for mutual support began to disintegrate as madness claimed more and more victims. The third day passed without rescue. By now, the survivors were dying in large numbers. Shark attacks continued relentlessly. Dehydration was claiming those who had drunk seawater. Exposure to the sun was causing heat stroke and organ failure. Drowning took those whose waterlogged life jackets could no longer keep them afloat. Some men simply gave up. They quietly removed their life jackets and slipped beneath the waves, preferring a quick death by drowning to the continued agony of waiting for rescue that seemed like it would never come. Others died without making any conscious decision, their bodies surrendering to exhaustion and dehydration. They would be talking to the man beside them one moment and floating dead the next. Through all of this, the Navy had no idea that anything was wrong. The route had never been checked. The arrival had never been confirmed. The ship had never been missed. Indianapolis and her crew had simply vanished from existence, forgotten by the system that was supposed to protect them. At late, the port director noted that Indianapolis had not arrived on July 31 as expected. He made no inquiry. He sent no messages. He assumed the ship had been diverted and went about his other business. At Philippine Sea Frontier Headquarters, no one was tracking Indianapolis at all. They had received notification of her movement, but had no system for confirming her progress. They assumed Late was handling it. At the receiving stations where the SOS had been received, no one followed up on the ignored distress calls. The messages had been dismissed or forgotten or lost. No one connected the dots. No one asked questions. No one did anything. The fourth day began with fewer than half of the original survivors still alive. Those who remained were in desperate condition, severely dehydrated, badly sunburned, weakened to the point of near complete exhaustion. Many had given up hope entirely. They continued to float only because their life jackets kept them at the surface. Too weak to remove them, too far gone to make any conscious decision about living or dying. And then, almost by accident, rescue finally came. Lieutenant Wilbur Gwyn was piloting a PV-1 Ventura patrol bomber on the morning of August 2, 1945, flying a routine anti-submarine patrol over the Philippine Sea. His mission had nothing to do with searching for survivors. He was looking for Japanese submarines, scanning the ocean surface for any sign of enemy activity. At approximately 10:30, Gwyn noticed something unusual in the water below. A long oil slick stretched across the surface, the kind of slick that might indicate a submarine leaking fuel. He descended to investigate what he assumed would be evidence of a damaged enemy vessel. What Gwyn saw when he got closer was not a submarine. It was hundreds of American sailors floating in the water, scattered across miles of ocean, many of them clearly dead, others waving weakly at his aircraft. He had stumbled upon the survivors of USS Indianapolis. Gwyn immediately radioed his base, reporting that he had found a large number of men in the water and requesting immediate assistance. He dropped his emergency supplies to the survivors below, life rafts and survival gear that some of them were too weak to reach. He began circling to mark their position and to get an accurate count of how many men were still alive. Even then, the response was confused. When Gwyn's report reached naval headquarters, officers were baffled. There was no record of any ship being lost in that area. No vessel was listed as missing or overdue. Where had these men come from? It took precious hours to determine that the survivors were from Indianapolis and to organize a proper rescue effort. The Navy had to work backward through its own records, confirming that Indianapolis had been en route from Guam to Leyte, confirming that she had never arrived, confirming that no one had checked on her or raised any alarm about her non-arrival. The failures of the tracking system were exposed in those frantic hours as officers tried to understand how a heavy cruiser could simply vanish without anyone noticing. The port director at Leyte had not reported the non-arrival. The Philippine Sea Frontier had not tracked the ship's progress. The receiving stations had not acted on the SOS. At every point where the system should have worked, it had failed. The first rescue ship to arrive was the destroyer escort USS Cecil J. Doyle, commanded by Lieutenant Commander W. Graham Claytor Jr. Claytor had heard Gwyn's radio reports and had diverted from his patrol without waiting for orders. He understood that every minute mattered, that men were dying in the water while the Navy organized its response. Cecil J. Doyle arrived at the scene after dark on August 2. Claytor made a decision that broke with standard procedure, but probably saved dozens of additional lives. He ordered his searchlights turned on and pointed straight up into the sky, creating beacons that survivors could see for miles. The lights would make his ship a target for any enemy submarines in the area, but Claytor judged that saving lives was more important than following rules designed for different circumstances. Through the night and into the next day, rescue ships arrived and began pulling survivors from the water. The rescuers were horrified by what they found. Many of the survivors were barely alive, so dehydrated and exhausted that they could not help themselves. Some fought against being rescued, their minds destroyed by seawater and trauma, unable to understand that help had finally come. The sharks were still circling, so bold after days of feeding that they approached the rescue ships without fear. Sailors had to shoot sharks with rifles to drive them away from survivors who were too weak to swim the final distance to safety. Some men died within sight of the rescue ships, their bodies giving out after days of waiting, unable to survive the final moments before salvation. When the rescue was complete and all surviving men had been pulled from the water, the final count was almost impossible to comprehend. Of approximately 196 men who had been aboard Indianapolis when she was torpedoed, only 316 had survived. About 300 had gone down with the ship. The remaining roughly 580 had made it into the water alive and had died over the following 4 days and 5 nights. It was the worst loss of life at sea in the history of the United States Navy. It was the worst shark attack in recorded human history, and it need never have happened. If the route had been checked, rescue could have come within hours of the sinking. If the arrival had been confirmed, the alarm would have been raised on July 31 when Indianapolis failed to appear at Leyte. If the SOS had been logged and acted upon, search planes could have been overhead by dawn on July 30. At any one of a dozen points, someone could have asked a simple question that would have saved hundreds of lives. Where is that ship? But no one asked. The route was never checked. The arrival was never confirmed. The SOS was never logged. 900 sailors vanished quietly into the Pacific Ocean, and nobody noticed for almost 5 days. The aftermath of the Indianapolis disaster was marked by controversy and recrimination. The Navy needed to assign blame, and Captain Charles McVeigh provided a convenient target. He was court-martialed in December 1945, charged with failing to zigzag and with hazarding his vessel. The court-martial focused on McVeigh's decisions rather than on the systemic failures that had allowed his ship to disappear without anyone noticing. The routing order that sent Indianapolis alone through dangerous waters was not thoroughly examined. The failed tracking system was not addressed. The ignored SOS messages were mentioned but not fully investigated. McVeigh was convicted on the charge of hazarding his vessel by failing to zigzag. He was the only American naval captain in World War II to be court-martialed for losing his ship to enemy action. The Japanese submarine commander who had sunk Indianapolis testified at the trial that zigzagging would not have prevented his attack. But the conviction stood anyway. The systemic failures that had actually caused the disaster were quietly buried. The port director, who had not reported the non-arrival, was not disciplined. The officers at the receiving stations who had ignored the SOS were not held accountable. The inadequate tracking procedures that had allowed a heavy cruiser to vanish without notice were not reformed in any meaningful way. McVeigh was restored to active duty after his conviction and eventually retired with the rank of Rear Admiral. But he never escaped the burden of blame that had been placed on his shoulders. For the rest of his life, he received hate mail from families who held him responsible for the deaths of their loved ones. Every year around the anniversary of the sinking, the letters would increase. On November 6, 1968, Charles Butler McVeigh III took his own life at his home in Connecticut. He was found with his Navy-issue revolver in his hand. He had carried the weight of the Indianapolis disaster for 23 years, blamed for failures that extended far beyond his control, and he had finally reached the limit of his endurance. The survivors of Indianapolis spent decades fighting to clear their captain's name. They believed passionately that McVeigh had been made a scapegoat for the Navy's own failures. They held reunions, maintained contact with each other, and campaigned tirelessly for recognition that their captain had been unjustly blamed. In 2000, more than 50 years after the court-martial, Congress passed a resolution stating that Captain McVeigh's record should reflect that he was exonerated for the loss of Indianapolis. The resolution came too late for McVeigh himself, who had been dead for over 30 years, but it meant everything to the survivors who had fought so long for this recognition. The wreck of Indianapolis was located in August 2017, lying on the ocean floor at a depth of over 18,000 feet. The ship was found by a civilian research team, finally locating the vessel that had been lost for over 70 years. For the survivors and their families, the discovery provided a measure of closure. Today, Indianapolis is recognized as a war grave, protected from salvage or disturbance. She lies with the men who went down with her, a permanent memorial to their service and sacrifice. The last known survivor of Indianapolis, Harold Bray Jr., passed away in November 2020 at the age of 94. With his death, the last living connection to the tragedy was severed, but the story lives on as a warning about the terrible consequences of bureaucratic failure. The men of Indianapolis completed one of the most important missions of World War II, delivering the components of the atomic bomb that would help end the conflict. They deserved to come home as heroes. Instead, they became victims of a system that forgot they existed, that failed to check their route, that failed to confirm their arrival, that failed to act on their distress calls. 900 sailors vanished quietly into the Philippine Sea. Their route was never checked. Their arrival was never confirmed. Their SOS was never logged. They died waiting for rescue that came 4 days too late, victims not just of Japanese torpedoes, but of American complacency and bureaucratic failure. The system that was supposed to protect them had broken down completely, and no one noticed because everyone assumed that someone else was doing the job. The tracking procedures that should have raised an alarm when Indianapolis failed to arrive were not followed, because following them would have required effort, would have created paperwork, would have demanded that someone take responsibility. Nobody wanted to take responsibility, and so 900 men died. The Indianapolis disaster stands as a permanent reminder that systems are only as good as the people who operate them. The most sophisticated tracking procedures are worthless if no one bothers to follow them. The most reliable communication systems are useless if the messages they carry are ignored. The most carefully designed redundancies fail if everyone assumes that someone else is handling the problem. Where is that ship? It was the simplest of questions. It should have been asked on July 31, 1945. When Indianapolis failed to arrive at late, it should have been asked on the morning of July 30, when the SOS was received and ignored. It should have been asked at a dozen different points by a dozen different officers who had the information and the authority to act. But no one asked. The route was never checked. The ship was never missed. And 900 American sailors paid for that failure with their lives. They vanished quietly, these men who had served their country with honor, who had carried the weapon that would end the war, who had done everything asked of them. They vanished into the vastness of the Pacific Ocean, into the jaws of sharks and the madness of dehydration, into the slow death of men abandoned by the very institution that was supposed to protect them. Their story is a tragedy of failures compounding failures, of assumptions replacing vigilance, of bureaucracy becoming the enemy of the men it was designed to serve. It is a story that should never be forgotten, because it reminds us of what happens when no one is willing to ask the simple questions, when everyone assumes that someone else is checking, when the route is never confirmed and the arrival is never verified. 900 sailors vanished quietly. CA-35's route was never checked, and by the time anyone thought to ask where that ship was, it was far too late to save the men who had sailed her into history and then into the forgotten depths of the sea.